Hello and welcome to part 5 of my Saw VII Rewrite. In the description of this video, you can find the link to the part 5 document, as well as links to parts 1 through 4. The purpose of the remainder of this video will be to discuss part 5. But before we get into that, the thumbnail for this video once again features art by Luke Headland. You can find a lot more of Luke's art in the links to his social media pages, which are also in the description of this video. When I decided to release this script in episodic installments, the way that I had originally planned to break it up was into 6 parts, each of which would have constituted half of the 3 acts to this story. Part 1 and Part 2 were Act 1, Part 3 and Part 4 were Act 2, and Part 5 and Part 6 were to be Act 3. Part 5 being the first half of the final act, in which the flashback storyline reaches its climax and is the main focus, while the present day storyline is less featured. And then Part 6, the second half of the final act, would be the inverse of that. The primary focus of Part 6 being the climax and resolution to the present day timeline, with a little bit more of the flashback timeline sprinkled in. Now, the only thing that has changed about that plan is that instead of the final act being 2 parts, it is now 3. The reason for that is that what was going to be just Part 5 ended up becoming nearly 100 pages, so it just made a lot more sense to split it in half and make this 7 parts, which does seem more fitting. That said, when you read Part 5 and then when you read Part 6, I think you'll see how they mirror each other structurally. When Part 5 became that long and I decided I was probably going to have to split it up, I was a bit concerned that there wasn't going to be a good enough place to do that. What I did was I literally just scrolled to the halfway point and found that where that ended actually wasn't the worst place to stop. But I think much more so than the previous 4 parts, it does kind of end in the middle of things. Regardless, we are now in the final act of the story. As I'm sure a lot of you can tell, one of the aspects of the original Saw films that I really enjoy is getting to revisit events and games specifically from the previous movies and getting to see some of the planning and or setup process. By the end of Saw 4, you know that both that movie and Saw 3 were happening concurrently, and therefore on the night of John's death, there were an incredible amount of moving parts with all of these interconnected games. And I was interested in exploring how the plans for something so complicated would have even begun to form. And so I had fun reverse engineering how that process may have started. You know, what would the main goals have originally been, and what would the seeds have been that would turn into what we see in those 2 films. That said, it also needed to be relevant to the story to show that. And to be honest, that's why I had to actually restrain myself from including more of the planning process for those games. Part of me really wanted to break that all down in even more detail just for the fun of that. But ultimately, I think I needed to cut it down to the more key moments, and hopefully I've done that well enough. In Saw 3D, when it's revealed that Lawrence has been helping John ever since his game, we do find out something that I think absolutely had to have been the case. that sequence shows us that it was Lawrence that suggested Lynn Denlin to be part of John's final games. And him being the one to suggest her had long been my interpretation as well. But there were a couple of things that absolutely did not work for me in how that was depicted in Saw 3D. One of which being that John apparently was already planning on testing Jeff, and then Gordon just came along and was like, oh, he happens to have this wife that I happen to know. In my mind, it would have made so much more sense if Lawrence, being friends or co-workers with Lynn, would have known all about her family situation. And it would have been Lawrence that brought Lynn and Jeff to John's attention. The other thing that really didn't work for me in how that was depicted is the kind of cold way that Lawrence says, oh yeah, hey, how about her, huh?
Jeff's wife, Dr. Lynn Denlin. She'll be perfect.
In my opinion, he should have been selecting her from a genuine desire to help her, as well as her husband. And seeing as this is the first time that Lawrence himself is nominating someone he knows to go through something like this, I also felt it should be something that he was conflicted with and hesitant to commit to at first. The conversation between John and Lawrence in that scene in my script, and honestly a number of the conversations that take place in Part 5, I want to once again reiterate that this is allegory. If you were to read these parts of my script literally, you would probably come away thinking that I think someone should be or would be justified in doing these types of things to other people. No, that is not what I'm saying. It is allegorical. What John and Lawrence are talking about in the context of the story represents how we sometimes have a tendency to try and help the people we love avoid immediate suffering at the cost of prolonging a more long-term type of pain or unhappiness. Sometimes we're afraid of confronting someone we care about with things that are unpleasant, but that, again, in the long term, would benefit them. So again, in my eyes, the original series and my conclusion to it, the purpose is not to refute the Jigsaw philosophy. It is to use it as allegory to provide commentary on real life. That's not to say that I don't think an interesting story is there to be told in which the Jigsaw philosophy gets deconstructed. In fact, I have mentioned this in one of my videos on this channel already, but I think that had the series concluded in the way I wanted it to end, and then you left that universe alone for a while, you could eventually have come back in another series of films where you return to this world and see what it looks like now that Jigsaw's philosophy has spread substantially, and you then explore the dangers and the horrors of that. The dangers and horrors of people having different interpretations of Jigsaw and his teachings, and of people manipulating that for their own ends. So basically you'd have the original series, which serves as the religious allegory, and then the sequel series could have been an allegory on religion, or organized religion specifically. And that's where you could really get into a critique of why nobody should be allowed to inflict these things on other human beings at their own discretion and based on their judgment alone. So yeah, sorry if that's a bit repetitive, but a criticism I've long been concerned about getting is that I am suggesting that Jigsaw is to be taken as a literal hero. Boy, do we have an exposition dump here. This is the sort of thing I would avoid in writing my own story. But I think Saw 5 failed in a big way that I felt I needed to compensate for. Basically, I don't think that having Hoffman explain this whole thing the way that I did was the way that we should have learned about the house being destroyed and rebuilt. The way I think that should have happened is by reworking the structure of 5 just a little bit. In the Saw 5 that exists, we have the Fatal 5 game, and then we have Strom going around town to past Jigsaw crime scenes and wildly theorizing about what might have happened and somehow magically being 100% correct. The Strom scenes serve as the framework for the flashbacks in which we learn how Hoffman first became associated with John. Meanwhile, you also have Hoffman going around doing these things that will eventually contribute to the narrative that Strom is the Jigsaw accomplice. Now, first of all, I want to say that I have grown to genuinely love Saw 5 over the years, even though there are a number of things that I think are objectively bad about it. But I think the way to fix what are by far the biggest criticisms I have of the movie is to keep all of the flashbacks, but have Hoffman be the framework. For example, after he gets the promotion and the award, and he goes back to his office and he finds the envelope with the note that says, "I know who you are." Have that be the setup to the flashback where he originally received such a note. And then instead of having Strom run around doing nothing as far as actual investigating, have him introduce us to this house fire investigation that he, Perez, and Carrie were looking into, and have it gradually be revealed that the 5 people in the game are the main people responsible for that house fire. So you would still have Erickson telling Strom at the beginning that he's off the case and that he needs to take time off. And you would still have Strom sneaking back into the office maybe and, still pursuing the case anyways. But instead of having him just randomly looking at names of victims on a list and being like, how did they abduct you? You have him start looking into the nerve gas house and what happened to it. And then by the end, when he actually goes to the house, that's where you have Hoffman show up and Strom is like, he's here and he's the one I suspect of being an accomplice. And he goes in and follows him in, and then that leads into the trap. The way that ending plays out in the Saw 5 movie is that Hoffman's running around town the whole film doing very incriminating things, and he's not being followed by Strom until the exact moment that he wants to be. And that's when he leads Strom to the house. And then Strom decides to enter, even though he doesn't seem to know that that's anything other than Hoffman's home. Anyways, I guess I'm going into that critique of Saw 5 as a way of trying to defend myself from criticism of this exposition dump. But it was important to me that the story make it clear what happened to that house and why Hoffman wanted it rebuilt. And in order to establish that, I also needed to establish how he would have gotten that accomplished. By this point, I'm sure you've noticed that I have included a lot of abduction scenes in my script. The reason for that is those scenes were really the only time that the Saw movies felt like horror to me. And a lot of these abduction scenes I've had versions of in my head for a long time, as just terrifying ways that you could depict these abductions. That said, I don't know how good of a job I did translating what I had in my head onto paper, but I'm hoping at least some people can imagine what I have in my head and hopefully also feel how frightening that would be. I have some things to say about Troy, but I'm going to save those for part 6. I keep talking about how John and Hoffman represent 2 different versions of Jigsaw and what they want Jigsaw to be. Earlier in this script, we kind of went into what things like the Billy Puppet and the pig head masks mean to John. But I also wanted to hint at what Hoffman, who uses these same things without them having the same meaning for him as they do for John. Basically, I wanted to hint at what they mean to Hoffman. As the alternative Jigsaw, I felt Hoffman should have his own mythology, and what he says to John in part 2 about what he imagined the Billy Puppet meaning in Seth's game, I think that continues to be true for Hoffman even after he learns what John's intentions were behind that. And when it comes to the pighead mask, I really like the idea that as a police officer, Hoffman has no doubt been called a pig as a derogatory term countless times over the years. And so for him to terrorize these people in the form of something that they called him as an insult, I imagine that he gets off on that on some level. I think that'll do it for part 5, but I hope you come back for part 6.
Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the 2 boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.